All right, thank you all for joining us. We have about 24 minutes, not 30, 24 minutes to cover how the private sector can be involved in making healthy and culturally relevant food more accessible and more affordable. So it's a lot to cover. Let's have you each just very briefly introduce yourselves and tell us what you do. Jessica, why don't you start?
My name is Jessica Walks First. I'm the executive chef and owner of Ketapanen Kitchen. We are Chicago's only indigenous catering company, and I am Chicago's only Native American executive chef.
And I'm Luke Saunders. I'm the founder and CEO of Farmer's Fridge. So thank you guys for joining us here today.
Hi. I'm Rick Bayless, and I'm the co-owner of the Frontera restaurant group, but we also work a lot in terms of local agriculture. We have a not-for-profit, the Frontera Farmer Foundation, that has raised over $3.5 million to invest in local farms to make them more profitable and productive, and also work a lot with education of young adults on the West Side through the Impact Culinary program that we started.
I'm Jim Slama. I run Naturally Chicago, which is a network that brings together all types of leaders in the natural products industry, investors, emerging brands, retailers, service providers, and with the goal of really making Chicago an epicenter of this booming industry.
Okay, so Luke, let's start with you. Farmer's Fridge, your whole mission is to make fresh, healthy food as easily accessible as a candy bar in a vending machine. But as you and I have discussed, that is not an easy proposition. That's not easy to do while keeping prices in check and being profitable. So I checked earlier today, and a 400-calorie pesto pasta bowl, I think like what you serve downstairs at the Fridge at the Museum of Science and Industry, where I am a huge consumer, is about $8.50. So walk us through what for you are some of the biggest challenges for keeping prices, lower for this sort of meal.
Yeah, so I think for us, scale is probably the number one thing. So when I started not far from here, we were renting a kitchen table by the hour. Today we do have a 100,000 square foot production facility where we make all of the food. But if you compare like how many salads we make to the number of granola bars Kellogg's is going to make today, it is like orders of magnitude different. And so when we look at like the cost of the food is actually pretty affordable, but then like getting to market, paying for the overhead, all of those things. I think my mic, okay, here it goes. And just in general too, the other thing to think through is what's the sticker price versus what's the actual price. And so a place like the Museum of Science and Industry, where it's a more transient audience, people are kind of in an entertainment mode, they may spend a little bit more, versus if you go to a hospital in the suburbs, you might see prices that are automatically 20% lower, and then you use the app and you actually get a 25% discount from there, and that's before you get a 10% loyalty credit or like expiring product discount. So we try to have the whole range where someone at the airport might be paying $12 and somebody at a hospital who's coming all the time may only pay $5.
And to your point about scalability, you and I were talking earlier about how if you can actually get repeat customers through incentivizing them through deals on the app, then actually that drives further unit purchases.
That's the other like critical components, like scale in our ability to buy produce and manufacture all the goods. But also like at the individual fridge level, volume is really the biggest driver of profitability. So if we're able to get more throughput in the fridge, we can actually charge less. And then some places, like we have a big revenue share to pay. So that's another dynamic where certain locations may ask for as much as 20% of the revenue that we collect, and we have to pass that on to consumers. So we're constantly trying to work with our partners to say, hey, if you can lower that fee, we can offer lower prices and things like that.
So scaling is key. I think you've got about 500 fridges across the country.
I think we'll be about 750 as education comes back online here in September. And then we have another 300 or so retail locations between Costco, Target, Hudson News.
Okay, so 750. What do you need to get to 750,000?
I mean, probably like, give me another 10 years. We started with one fridge 10 years ago, and now we have 1,000 locations. And when you do the math on what that looks like if we just do the same thing we did for the last 10 years, that's about where you get. So yeah, just buy some salad and tell your friends about it.
Okay, so 10 years, we'll check back.
Yeah, just some of this takes time, right? We got to hire the drivers and build the machines and buy the lettuce. So.
Okay, Jim, you work with a lot of natural food brands, which is a description that I know for a lot of consumers just translates into, expensive. Will natural food brands sort of always be for those with deep pockets, or is there, and if not, how does that change?
First of all, I want to address the costs of non-natural food, and it's huge, whether it be public health issues and the cost for all types of diet-related disease, or the externalities associated with pollution, with bad agricultural practices, the unbelievably horrible practices of animal agriculture that are just atrocious, that nobody should be, in my opinion, have to eat those types of products. That's a big deal. In order to change that, we need, to Luke's point, scale up natural foods that are produced in a responsible way. And in order to do that, we need a lot more people eating it, including people who can't afford it. So, and there's two answers to this question. One is, how do we get folks who don't have enough money to pay for it? And granted, it is more expensive, in part because of scale and in part because of, just other issues with our agricultural system. So, there are programs to help folks who can't afford more expensive food, and it's double bucks programs at farmers markets. It's programs where you can get a prescription for produce, which of course is much healthier, and you can get produce at a reduced or no cost. We just need much more of that support, both from a public sector as well as from the philanthropic sector. On the, how do we get natural food less expensive? We need to scale. And so, there's a lot of programs out there that are helping companies to scale. We just launched one called Locally Made, where we're working with emerging brands in Chicago to help them get on the shelves in a lot more supermarkets. And, I'm thrilled. We got Jewel, Mariano's, 7-Eleven, Fresh Time, some others that are coming on board to offer space to emerging brands. That's a big deal, because if we do it here in Chicago, naturally Chicago is one of 10 networks across the country. New York, LA, San Francisco, we can take this program across the country into programs and make these types of programs available across the country, but also give these entrepreneurs access to supermarkets across the country as well.
And just to pick up on scaling, I think when we talked earlier, you mentioned, I'm curious, what are some of the biggest challenges to scaling that you see with the brands, the smaller brands that you work with? I think you mentioned, just access to capital.
Sure, access to capital is a huge one. I launched the first food financing conferences, I think, maybe in America in 2009. Whole Foods is my partner. We've been doing that for a long time. This year we had 10 brands pitching for capital. I think 75 investors were there, and despite the really challenging environment, quite a few of them are getting financed. So that's one thing. We're launching a mentoring program. In fact, I pried Rick Bayless's former partner, Greg Keller, off the ski slopes in Utah, who's now working with us half-time. And he's both leading Locally Made, but he's also helping us develop this mentoring program. And my guess is by the end of the year, we'll have 75 to 100 mentors working with emerging brands who are really looking to scale up. And and for them, it's like, okay, how do I work with a co-packer? Which is not an easy thing. Rick's lucky. He had Jean Marie Bronson, who's a genius at those kind of things, and work with the co-packer to make sure that they got Rick's recipe to the point where he would actually approve it to go on shelf. Not everybody has that kind of skill, and we're hoping to develop a broad enough network of mentors to really help these entrepreneurs scale up and be more successful.
And I think you also mentioned some of the fees that come along with working with a co-manufacturer as well as with distributors, and ways that you're sort of helping the small brands, navigate some of those.
No question. Well, we're fortunate. We've got, the largest natural and organic distributor. KeHE is our partner. Their CEO was a co-founder of Naturally Chicago. They're all in on this program. They're going to be a big help. But, there's really a whole spectrum of needs that these brands have, and we're going to try our best to get them as much technical assistance as possible to succeed.
Okay, so Rick, you have talked a lot in the past about your goal to make restaurant work a viable career path, for folks, and efforts that you've made in your own restaurants to pay a fair wage, to offer benefits, and I think just recently instituted this 20% mandatory service charge on all checks, with that goal in mind. So that all has an impact then on how much you have to charge patrons for each of your menu items and the size ultimately of guest checks. So how do you think about the trade-offs between charging diners enough to cover those costs while keeping prices low enough to attract a diversity of diners?
Well, it's a very interesting thing. We're hearing a lot about scaling here, and when you're talking about consumer packaged goods, then yes, scaling is an amazing thing. In restaurants, we can't really scale. If we're a busy restaurant, we can only fit so many people in the restaurant, and every single person's every dish is made for that person. So it's not like we're making really big batches of something that we're putting in jars and then selling to people on a store shelf. So I will say that when we're talking about restaurants, and I just in exactly the same way that we cannot put all food in the same category, I think we have to talk about the difference between basically processed food and whole foods. Okay, and if we don't make that distinction, then we're comparing apples and oranges when we need to be comparing apples and apples. So we could say in the whole food sector, it's like going to a restaurant that's making everything from scratch. Then we have to talk about the restaurants where everything is frozen and finished and dehydrated and whatever. But it's basically processed food that you're getting there. We can't compare those two things. So coming out of the pandemic, we were forced to really think differently about everything. We're building a whole new model now, I would say, in the restaurant industry for how to run restaurants and what you can put on your menus, what you can't put on your menus, who's going to come, what their expectations are going to be. So it is a whole new world for us in the restaurant world, and I don't think probably for the next 3 or 4 years we will really understand it because we're trying all kinds of new things all the time. So our goal was to come out of the pandemic and to offer out. We lost so much of our staff, people that had been with us 30 years. They had to go find other jobs because they couldn't rely on the restaurant industry anymore to pay their mortgage and to pay for their children's education. And so we had to come out and figure out a way that we could create an environment where people could rely on their paychecks. And when we're talking about this, it's people in the front of the house that we're talking about who basically don't work for the restaurant. They work for you, the person sitting at the table, because you're going to be paying their salary. So they have to talk to you in a certain way, deal with you in a certain way so that they can pay their mortgage, okay? And so I don't like that. I feel like that we all need to be working on the same team. And so we came out and we instituted this thing where we pay a living wage, and we're not talking $15 an hour because servers don't make $15 an hour when all is said and done, but a wage that they could count on for whether we're busy or whether we're slow. They're always going to make the same amount of money. And that has worked out really good for us because we were rebuilding a team. And we didn't know if we could promise people that we were going to be busy. Because there were days in 2021 when we had more employees on staff than we had customers in our restaurant. And so we were trying to build something that was more equitable and that people could really rely on. And so that has been one of our focuses. But when it comes down to what do we charge? So people came back to restaurants slowly. People had actually learned to cook stuff in their own homes. And so it was like we were trying, and a lot of them liked it, you know? A lot of them said, you know, I love baking sourdough bread. I mean, I know that's the sort of the whipping horse there that we all talked about, but people decided that there were dishes that they could make with real ingredients, and they could make them quickly, and they could enjoy that kind of thing. So they came back to restaurants slowly. But we realized that we also they couldn't come back to restaurants, and the prices were just astronomical, which would make them go, oh, we won't do that again. We know how to cook in our house. And so we had to keep everything really low in the cost. Now, everybody has heard that all the prices on everything that we buy for restaurants went up, okay? But we didn't raise our prices. Instead, we re-engineered our menus. And so we had to create dishes or create variations on dishes that we could do for the old price, even though the prices for us, the cost of goods had really, really skyrocketed.
So give us an example of that menu engineering.
I'm sorry?
Give us an example of that menu engineering.
Okay, well, I will say that there are things that you can do. Everybody loves pasta dishes, right? And you're willing to pay $18 for a pasta dish when it has very little ingredients really in it, but somehow that's a cool thing, and so we think that there's great value in that, and so we do that. So we looked at what people do for pasta dishes and said, okay, well, in Frontera, our pasta dish is an enchilada. And so we could make more enchiladas on the menu because people like them. And so we're going to give you a little bit more of that category of dish because in the filling, we can put a smaller amount of protein in there. And protein just went out the roof in terms of price. So we can do that, more vegetables. We can create dishes that everybody's going to want to eat, but we can engineer them in such a way that we can actually afford to put them on the menu. So we're spending less money on that plate of food, keeping it the same menu price, and that allowed for the offset and the incredible rise in labor that we were paying. So we're still trying to figure out what the right balance is going to be, but that's the kind of engineering that we did on literally every single dish on our menu.
And just because it's a really big part of your cost and therefore what people are paying at a restaurant, I'll say, I think when we spoke, you mentioned that pre-pandemic, like your labor costs were about 30%, and now they're around 45.
42 to 45, okay? So that means in the national average for what's on the bottom line in a restaurant is 6%. I know that those of you that have always dreamed, because you love throwing dinner parties, dreamed of having restaurants, when you read that statistic, you usually say, really? No, it should be 20% at least. But no, the national average is 6%. And, you know, people used to say 30% for food and 30% for labor and 22% for your fixed costs. And that gives you 8% left on, well, that went out the window completely. And so we're having to try to figure out how we can renegotiate that without losing money on the other end. And it's a lot of trial and error for us right now, but we're dedicated to being able to do that because we believe that there is great value in restaurants that cook real food, that don't use processed foods. Processed foods, you know, they're very cheap. And there's such a, right now with the cost of goods the way it is, it's like, oh, can't we just, no. And we say, no, we gotta buy good whole foods so that we can keep alive this tradition. We also have to train staff in the kitchen. And that's another thing that is a huge investment for us.
Okay, so I want to come back to tipping because that does affect the cost quite a bit.
Just trying to stir up the pot here because last time I spoke about this in a group, which I think you know about, it stirred the pot a lot.
Yes, okay, so we'll come back to tipping, but I want to be sure we get to Jessica. Jessica, you run Ketapanen Kitchen, which serves things like Bison Street tacos and indigenous tamales, everything which sounds delicious. You've talked about how a big barrier to marketing more of this food to more consumers is just plain availability of indigenous ingredients. So tell us, what exactly is the problem and what are some things that you see being done to solve it?
Well, the problem is I can't go into any food suppliers and buy my ingredients. I can't even go into a local grocer and buy them. The ingredients that are, true traditional ingredients, I mean, the only place you're going to find those is in Indian country. A lot of my ingredients I have to drive 500 miles for. I have to order from like Cheyenne River across the country or blueberries from the East Coast to get those ingredients in because, what I can use in stores, I call replicas. I refuse to use processed ingredients. They're not healthy. There's nothing, there's no value in them to me, especially, for us as natives, we believe that every food has a spirit. So if I want to convey the true meaning of a dish and to really, focus on that food, it has to have that spirit and it's not going to be genetically modified. So, for me, how do I get these ingredients? How do we make them accessible to us without incurring these heavy shipping costs or me driving 500 miles on a Saturday to pick up ingredients and then I'm exhausted when I get back to the kitchen? So we have thought this like in the long term, what is that solution? And it is to create more farming spaces, more community garden spaces, more farmers markets. We have to deindustrialize our foodways to grow in a good way and bring healthy food to the table. If we're growing all as communities, we can feed everybody without incurring high costs. As it stands in our community, we have one native garden space. The Cheyenne Nations has a garden space, but that can't sustain a whole community. They do a great job there, but we need more spaces like that. And to have those spaces, we need access to capital. And quite frankly, native entrepreneurs and businesses don't get the support that they need. When I launched my business, I had zero support. So I had to build and grow and figure things out on my own, but I do have a good team behind me and I do have a good support system now, but my ultimate goal is to launch a farm where we grow our traditional foods, make them accessible to our community, make them accessible to the communities that surround us, have people live on our farm in a small house village in exchange for working on the farm. That way they don't have to incur some of the cost of living. We have to be able to help each other to grow further. So it means, more hands-on. It's not about, what is all these companies gonna do to make things better for us? It has to be about what we do. We have to be good stewards of the land. We have to take interest in growing and feeding ourselves in a happy way. We can't count on everybody to do it for us. So my long-term outlook is to start growing, and my sous chef who's standing over there, he is amazing with that stuff, and we have some really serious goals ahead of us, but they involve a great big community space here, and I hope that other organizations will join us and say, hey, this is really needed. Let's open up some more community garden plots. Let's start growing healthier foods. And I'm not talking about GMO seeds. I'm talking about true, there's seed banks all over the place that carry traditional native food seeds. We need to start growing those things. We need to stay away from, the creator didn't make those genetically modified foods. We need to go back to the true seeds and true foods, and because those are what's healthy for us. You look at diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, those all come from the chemicals in our food system. And if we want a healthier next 7 generations, we have to do the work now. We have to change the outlook, and that means going back to the way things were. To progress, we need to regress.
So if there happened to be any willing investors, say, in this audience, what would be on your wish list for building more aviaries and sugarbush camps and some of the other berrybush fields, some of the other things that you mentioned as so important to then building, making your sourcing opportunities more widely available?
A farm space would be my biggest thing on the wish list that has clean soil. That's my biggest. If we can get into a space and then start building, I think our community will come together and make it happen, but first we need a space to start that at.
And are there other promising examples where this is happening? You mentioned Cheyenne River. Are there others that we can look at?
Well, Cheyenne Nations Garden on the north side of Chicago by Montrose and Pulaski, they've got a native garden. It's beautiful, and it's a youth group that's doing this. So they have the model right, but they also did it on their own with minimal support. We need more spaces like that and more people to support those spaces and help us to develop them and open them up, not just to the Native community, but all the communities, because most especially communities of color, because we seem to be the ones that suffer the most with health issues related to our foodways. And we are the ones that are often most ignored when it comes to issues issues like these. So I think, there's a lot of work to be done, but again, we have to kind of turn back the clock on things and become homesteaders again, if you will. Farmers, gardeners, agriculturalists, we have to do those things in order to heal our foodways. And I think that's truly the only way that things will change here in this, country. We have to look at ways to eat healthier by growing healthier.
Okay, you have your marching orders. We will say we're out of time. We'll have to save tipping for another day.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you all so much.
What a great panel. I want to reiterate what Chef Jessica said about the way we can go forward and have the 7 generations ahead of us do better is by going back and looking at some of these traditional methods and traditional seeds that are so important to Native communities and to all of us. So thank you for bringing that up. It was a beautiful point.